American aircraft were being torn apart by the infamous Japanese Zero. No Allied aeroplane could match the agile dogfighter. Then the US Navy unleashed the powerful new F-6F Hellcat, the legendary warbird destined to destroy over 5,000 enemy aircraft and score the greatest kill ratio of any fighter in the Second World War. Now, using state-of-the-art computer animation, we put you in the cockpit for the clash of the Titans. The American Hellcat versus the Japanese Zero. Experience the battle. Examine the tactics as we reenact the dogfights of the Zero Killer. October 1943, a flight of American F-6F Hellcats from the carrier Yorktown streaked towards Wake Island, a small Japanese-held base in the Central Pacific. Their mission was to establish air superiority and attack ground installations. The brand new Hellcat had yet to face off in a dogfight against the most feared fighter in the Pacific, the Japanese Zero. 22-year-old Navy fighter pilot Ensign Robert Duncan was well aware of the Zero's fearsome reputation.
When we went up against the Zero, I was intimidated. Most of us were, because we knew they had a good plane. We knew just exactly what the Zero could do, how fast it was, how high it could go, how well they could hit with it.
Suddenly, a glint of metal caught Duncan's eye. In the distance was a Japanese Zero.
I don't think he was aware of the fact that we were there, because it was in the morning. The sun was just barely coming up, and I'm not sure he even saw us.
The other American pilots didn't see the Zero, and Duncan's radio was out. Cockpit radios of that era were new and unreliable. Unable to warn the others, he tried to alert his flight leader using hand signals.
And I tried to get up with him in point, like that. And I saw that he wasn't going to get in position quick enough.
The key of this story is not that he's up trying to communicate and tell the guy what's going on, because the priorities are aviate, navigate, and then communicate. Duncan tries to tell his flight leader. When it fails, he goes with the general prudential rule, which is, when in doubt, win the war. And he breaks off and he leads the way.
Duncan banked left to intercept. He opened the throttle and the Hellcat's 2,000 horsepower kicked in. He was closing fast. The Zero is here. Duncan moves to the enemy's 9 o'clock. From this position, Duncan must shoot from a steep angle. Leading the target with his gunfire is critical.
Guys don't put in enough lead. They tend to want to point at their target, which is a common human tendency. Point at the target and shoot. But if you do that, every bullet you shoot is going to be behind your target. So you have to pull your nose out in front, shoot out in front, and basically let those bullets meet that target in a point in space.
Duncan's technique was perfect.
I just held what I had, and he flew right in front of me. And it was the easiest shot I've ever made. I opened up and he blew up immediately.
Duncan's .50 caliber rounds detonated the Zero's unarmored fuel tank. Ensign Robert Duncan had just scored his first aerial kill of the war. But it was also another major milestone.
I was the first one with a Hellcat to ever shoot down a Zero.
There was no time to celebrate, though, as Duncan was about to go head-to-head against a Japanese fighter ace with 9 kills. And the Navy would soon find out if the Grumman F-6F Hellcat was truly a match for the Japanese Zero. The Mitsubishi A6M20 was deadly from the start. In its first 4 months of operations over China in 1940, the lightweight maneuverable fighter scored 59 kills for no losses. Through the early months of the Second World War, Japanese aerial victories mounted. The truth was inescapable. The 300-mile-per-hour Zero, or Zeke as it was codenamed, was the most capable fighter in the Pacific.
The exceptional range and performance of the Zero was evident from the first day of the Pacific War. You had a naval fighter capable of engaging and defeating land-based enemies almost routinely, and that was a situation for which America and Britain were totally unprepared.
The Navy's best available fighter to combat the Zero was the F-4F Wildcat. It compared favorably with the Zero for firepower, but was no match for it in speed or maneuverability.
The Wildcat was the one that was out there holding the line at the beginning. It had some disadvantages. It was underpowered, for one thing, and the climbing wasn't that good. The guns weren't always working properly.
In a Wildcat, even being on a Zero's tail was treacherous.
You couldn't outturn a Zero. If you were behind a Zero and didn't maintain your speed properly, they would say that the Zero would be on your tail inside of 2 turns.
Range was another problem. The Zero's range was 1,150 miles. The Wildcat's range was only 770 miles.
The Zero fought the Wildcat in the Pacific Theater, which is the largest battleground there's ever been in human history. The Pacific Ocean covers something like 60 million square miles of planet Earth, and that meant that any aircraft committed to that battle was going to have long legs.
It was clear a more powerful fighter was needed to challenge the Zero. The Navy accelerated the development of the new F-6F Hellcat. The Hellcat was a key element of a new strategic naval concept. Fast aircraft carriers replacing battleships as the main strike force.
By October 1943, the Pacific War had been going on for nearly a year and a half. It really had taken that long for the Pacific Fleet to not only recover from Pearl Harbor, but to actually produce from scratch the fleet it really needed to have to wage war across the broad Pacific. Wake Island was like a proving ground for this brand new military machine the world had not seen up to that point.
The new Essex-class carriers packed a powerful punch, with an air wing of 36 dive bombers, 18 torpedo planes, and 36 fighters. This force would be tested in the heat of battle at Wake Island. 5th of October 1943. Ensign Robert Duncan had just scored the first air-to-air Zero kill for the Hellcat, but the fight was far from over. Duncan had spotted a Zero with a Hellcat on its tail, but the Hellcat was the one in trouble. It just didn't know it.
At that time, I looked up above, and there was a Zero about 300 feet above me. And he started down to get behind this Hellcat that was chasing the Zero, but he wasn't in range to get our man.
Duncan is here. The first Zero is here. The other Hellcat pilot is on his 6 o'clock. The second Zero is diving, gaining airspeed and closing on the Hellcat. Duncan, out of range for machine gun fire, must close the distance. He added power, climbed and banked left. Duncan knew he couldn't reach the Zero, but maybe he could shake him off the Hellcat's tail.
So I tried something. I just pulled up the nose of my airplane. I was still not in range, and I cut loose with a burst. Just like you take a hose and shoot out like that.
It worked. The Zero pulled away. But now it was Duncan in trouble.
He dropped off from our man and made a left turn, hard left turn out like this, around to come around to me.
Duncan pulled into a hard left turn to evade the Zero. Both planes circled each other in tight left turns. Each pilot had the stick hard to the left, coaxing their fighters into tighter turns, trying to gain an advantage on the other. The Zero got a firing angle first, and 20mm cannon fire ripped through Duncan's tail.
I didn't have any fear toward what was going to take place. Generally, I didn't have any. It was afterwards that my knees started.
What happened next took Duncan by surprise. The Zero suddenly pulled out of the turn and went vertical.
And I looked, and I said, what's with this guy? He must be right out of flight training. He's going to get himself killed.
But Duncan was wrong. The Japanese pilot was no trainee. He was Warrant Officer Toshiyuki Soeda, a feared fighter ace with 9 kills. He'd used this climbing tactic before and emerged victorious every time.
My name is Terry Shepard. I'm a Green Beret sent on...
In 1943, American aircraft were attacking the Japanese base at Wake Island. This raid was a critical test for the new fast carriers and the Hellcat fighters. Their effectiveness would determine the strategy for the rest of the Pacific War. Ensign Robert Duncan was dueling with a formidable Japanese ace, Toshiyuki Soeda. Soeda had made a bold move. He'd taken the fight into the vertical, where the Zero excelled. The maneuver was a favorite Japanese tactic. The Zero climbed far better than the Wildcat. Many Zero pilots lured the older American aircraft into a vertical climb, waited for them to stall below, then rolled over and pounced for an easy kill. Duncan climbed aggressively after the Zero. Exactly what Soeda wanted him to do.
So I started up after him. I poured the coal onto it.
But this wasn't the underpowered Wildcat. The new Hellcat, with superchargers whining, easily matched pace with the Zero. Soeda reached the top of his climb and confidently nosed over, anticipating the sight of a stalled American aircraft below. The reality was much different. The 2,000 horsepower Hellcat had energy to spare. Duncan skillfully lined up the Zero and fired.
When I got him up there on the top, I just shot him down as you would shoot down any plane, and watched him go in. I thought, poor young fella, you sure didn't know what you were doing.
The Zero burst into flames and spiraled down towards the sea. The Japanese ace had made a fatal error. He thought he was dogfighting the old American Wildcat.
I then realized why he did what he did. He'd shot down most of his planes, pulling this trick with the Wildcat.
This is what probably would have happened if Duncan had been flying the 8,000-pound Wildcat.
If he'd been in a Wildcat, the chances are he would have stalled out at the top before the Zero. The Wildcat would have gone up, gone greedy, tried to get the shot, couldn't get the shot, stalled early because it's a heavier airplane with heavier wing loading, and fallen away. And the Zero, watching from above, rolls behind him, catches him out of this stall, and shoots him. That's the way pilot.
If I had been in that Wildcat, I would have been shot down. There's no question in my mind about it. But I'd have been too smart to do that.
The two-day raid on Wake Island was a stunning victory for the new fighter. The Hellcat downed 22 Zeros. Opposition over Wake had been neutralized. And the Americans went on to destroy 90% of the Japanese ground facilities. 6 Hellcats were lost in dogfights. Another 6 fell to anti-aircraft fire. The F-6F had demonstrated its mettle against the rising sun. Back in the US, the engineers at Grumman Aircraft breathed a sigh of relief. Their careful design and testing had paid off. The process had started on the 30th of June, 1941, nearly 6 months before Pearl Harbor, when Grumman Aircraft was awarded the contract to upgrade the F-4F Wildcat.
Grumman had a very long-term relationship with the Navy. They had put fighters onto Navy decks since the very beginning of naval aviation at sea. So Grumman knew what the requirements were of flying out at sea. They knew what the requirements were to take a fighter and make a carrier suitable.
At first, the new aeroplane was slated to be a modest improvement over the Wildcat, but the US Navy, wary of the Zero's dominance in China, demanded more. The key to the design was the engine. The engineers chose the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. At 2,000 horsepower, it had almost twice the power of the Wildcat. The larger engine demanded an expanded fuselage and wings. This allowed for larger fuel tanks, yielding an increased range of 300 miles over that of the Wildcat. Grumman equipped the new F-6F Hellcat with 6 50 caliber machine guns and the same rugged construction and heavy armor protection that earned the company the nickname Ironworks. The aircraft featured thick armor plating around the engine and cockpit, bullet-resistant windscreens, and rubber-coated self-sealing fuel tanks.
Grumman, as a designer, had tremendous respect for the pilots in terms of their lives and their safety. They knew that it was not enough for a pilot to just go out and fight. You had to give them the ability to sustain damage and come home.
On the 26th of June, 1942, Grumman test pilot Selden Converse successfully flew the first prototype Hellcat. Soon, an entire factory was dedicated to Hellcat production, with 20 planes a day rolling off the assembly line. By January 1943, the new aircraft was delivered to the fleet. The Hellcat had gone from prototype to carrier operations in less than a year. Experienced Wildcat pilot and flight instructor Robert Duncan well remembers the first time he flew a Hellcat.
And I thought, boy, this is a wonderful plane. It's a 100% better plane than the Wildcat. And I flew it right off the bat without any difficulty. It was like sitting in the seat of your mother's lap.
The Hellcat wasn't just better than the Wildcat. It was better than the enemy's Zero. The Hellcat flew about 30 miles per hour faster than the Zero. The F-6F had a comparable rate of climb, but because of its power and weight, could easily outdive the Zero. The Hellcat could also take tremendous punishment and keep on flying, something the lightly armored Zero could not do.
The Zero did not have self-sealing tanks, and if you got one of the gas tanks, and it would catch on fire in a hurry. We had 6 50 caliber guns, and you fire the 6 of those and you can start tearing pieces off of it.
11th of November, 1943. 1 month after the Wake Island attack, American Dauntless and Avenger bombers headed for the key Japanese naval base at Rabaul, escorted by a flight of Hellcats. The new carrier task force relentlessly assaulted the Japanese outposts.
Rabaul was a tough nut to crack, and everyone going in knew that. The Japanese had invested a considerable amount of materiel in turning Rabaul into a bastion, and so moving into Rabaul to launch a carrier strike was not looked upon as being any kind of easy endeavor.
22-year-old Hellcat pilot, Lieutenant Junior Grade Hamilton McWhirter, scored his first kill at Wake. At Rabaul, he would earn his reputation as a brilliant aerial fighter in one of the most famous dogfights of the Second World War. A combined strike force of American bombers and fighters moved in to attack Japanese ships in the harbor at Rabaul. The bombers began their dive attacks. Lieutenant Hamilton McWhirter nosed his Hellcat over to stay with them. He pulled out and started a strafing run on a Japanese cruiser, running a lethal gauntlet of 25mm anti-aircraft fire and 8-inch shells.
In these situations, everything's coming back at him. Japanese heavy rounds, machine gun rounds, everything is spraying at him. He is fearless as he's bearing down on these ships.
The Hellcat's 6 50 caliber machine guns could put 4,000 rounds per minute on the target. Every 5th projectile was a white-hot phosphorus incendiary round.
And when they hit, you got a nice bright flash. I can still see it in my mind. The superstructure of that cruiser lit up like our Christmas tree.
McWhirter pulled up and headed for the rendezvous point. As he climbed, he spotted a dozen Hellcats and 30 or more Zeros fighting it out in one big frenzied swarm.
It reminds me of what you used to see in the movies about World War I. Planes all over the sky, exploding, parachutes, planes going down.
Hamilton McWhirter was about to become a Hellcat legend. But to do so, he would need to draw on both his 8 months of flight training and some very special intelligence derived from a chance discovery. In June 1942, a US Navy flying boat on routine patrol over Akutan Island in the Aleutians spotted a downed aircraft partially submerged in the soft, marshy soil. It was an intelligence coup, a virtually undamaged A6M2 Mitsubishi Zero. The plane, dubbed the Akutan Zero, was hurriedly shipped to San Diego, where it was rebuilt, repainted with US markings, and thoroughly flight tested by the Americans.
Having the Zero in hand allowed us to actually test it and to compare it to all of our existing fighters, to tell where its strengths were and where its weaknesses were. That's not an academic exercise. That's an exercise to tell our pilots where they are strongest, where the Zero is weakest, therefore where to force him so that you can beat him in a dogfight.
A key find was that the Zero had a disadvantage in a high-speed dive. Above 200 knots, its ailerons froze, restricting any kind of rolling maneuver, especially to the right. This important data was quickly passed to Grumman engineers and on to the fleet. Now Hamilton McWhirter would put it into practice. McWhirter was headed into a swirling mass of Zeros and Hellcats. He'd spotted a Hellcat with a Zero on its 6 o'clock.
I could see big pieces of metal flying off the Hellcat.
The damaged Hellcat is here. The Zero is right behind him. McWhirter is here. He will pull a high G climbing turn to get behind the Zero. McWhirter's Hellcat easily closed the distance as his machine gun shredded the Zero's unarmored fuselage. Then McWhirter got a good look at his first kill of the day.
I looked down right into the cockpit. Hadn't been more than a second or so since I'd fired, and there were flames coming out from under the instrument panel. He had no chance whatsoever. The Zero had no armor plate behind the pilot.
Then he spotted another Zero at 1 o'clock high, about 2,000 feet away. He pitched up and banked right, onto an intercept course. It looked like another easy kill. But suddenly, he was jolted by a loud noise.
Best way I can describe it is if you're standing in a metal shed and someone throws a couple of big handfuls of rocks against the outside. That's what it sounds like when your plane gets hit by machine gun bullets. Very loud, and you can actually feel the impact of the bullets hitting.
McWhirter was so focused on his target, he didn't see the plane that had begun peppering his Hellcat.
It's the bogey you don't see that will generally get you. McWhirter target fixates on the Zero that he's going for. And much to his surprise, he hears noise on his aircraft that alerts him, that says, get your head up and look around, get your head on a swivel.
A Zero, making a high-speed pass from above, had raked his Hellcat with machine gun fire. Stunned, McWhirter looked around to find 2 more Zeros directly on his tail. McWhirter is here, chasing a Zero. The Zero shooting at him is here. McWhirter never sees this plane, but its gunfire actually saves his life by alerting him to the Zeros behind him.
At that point, he's in a life and death situation, and he's got to take immediate action to get out of there.
Remembering the lessons learned from the Akutan Zero, McWhirter dived steeply towards the ocean directly below. The Japanese, knowing their planes couldn't compete in a dive with a Hellcat, decided not to follow.
At that point, he looks through his windscreen and sees an aircraft passing directly in his line of travel. McWhirter slides his aircraft into the same plane with the Zero and rakes him with gunfire and gets a kill.
Now he's had his second kill within about 45 seconds. And it's all just due to good airmanship, maintaining his situational awareness, executing that nose-low maneuver when he was being attacked by an unseen Zero, sets himself up for an attack on another aircraft.
It's an incredible accomplishment, one that's respected by every generation of fighter pilot.
2 kills in 45 seconds would be outstanding. It'd be awesome. Fighter pilot's dream.
But McWhirter wasn't out of the woods yet. He pulled his aircraft up out of its dive, climbed to 3,000 feet, and again headed for the rendezvous point. Then, from 11 o'clock, another Zero dived directly towards him. McWhirter broke left in order to engage. The Zero rolled towards the Hellcat. The enemy has the advantage of altitude. That translates to more energy, and thus more speed. He should be able to counter any move McWhirter makes. But even though the Zero had the advantage, he suddenly veered away from the Hellcat and made a run for it.
Whereas the Japanese Zero used to be the king of battle and have the upper hand, now the Japanese recognize the Hellcat has arrived. They understand the strengths, and they know they can't fight the Hellcat one-on-one.
A week later, Hamilton McWhirter scored 2 more kills, earning him a coveted title, the first Hellcat ace.
The Hellcat shot down more planes than any other American fighter. 5,300 planes, 305 aces. And I just happened to be the first Hellcat ace.
The November the 11th attack on Rabaul lasted less than 1 hour. The Americans sunk the Japanese destroyer Suzanami and destroyed 20 aircraft. Later that day, the Japanese launched a counterattack, but they were intercepted en route, and another 35 Japanese planes were downed. So many enemy pilots were lost, the Japanese couldn't effectively respond to the invasion of Tarawa less than 2 weeks later. The tide was turning against the Empire of Japan. The Hellcat, through superb engineering and tactics, was truly becoming a zero killer. 3 months later, the Hellcat would face its fiercest test, attacking the might of the Japanese Navy head-on. Waves of Hellcat fighters sped towards Truk Atoll. Their mission was to destroy enemy shipping in the highly defended Japanese stronghold. 25-year-old Lieutenant Junior Grade Alex Vrashu flew with a division of 12 Hellcats from the aircraft carrier Intrepid.
This was a mission that had us going against an enemy that we weren't certain of, but we felt confident. And I guess that's what a fighter pilot's supposed to be confident, or he can't do his job.
Truk Atoll in the Caroline Islands was Japan's main anchorage in the South Pacific. They had been fortifying the atoll with port facilities and runways since the end of the First World War.
Truk was billed as almost impregnable. Their version of Gibraltar or Pearl Harbor. And the propaganda was very strong that Truk would be an incredibly tough fight.
The barrier reefs that surrounded Truk put the atoll out of range of the battleship's big guns. The only way in was by air. The plan called for a 2-day raid. Day 1 was a fighter sweep. 72 Hellcats from 6 carrier air wings would swarm in to eliminate the enemy's fighters, clearing the way for Day 2, when Dauntless, Avenger, and Helldiver bombers would target the anchored Japanese fleet with high-explosive 500-pound bombs.
This was going to be an attack of annihilation. So what you're seeing with the Truk raid is a systematic approach to taking a substantial shore bastion and reducing it to nothingness.
Pure fighter sweeps were rare. The Hellcat pilots were anxious for a raid unencumbered by bomber escort duties.
It was the first time we didn't have to escort, and we were just pure fighter, we call ourselves. And as we got closer and closer to it, and being in a plane that we knew we could handle, I'll tell you, quite honestly, we were looking forward to it.
Vrashu and his wingman, Lou Little, brought up the rear of their 12-plane formation. As they flew the 90 miles from their carrier, they stayed low in order to avoid enemy radar. Approaching the atoll, they climbed to 13,000 feet. The higher altitude gave them better visibility and positioned them for diving attacks.
You want to have an altitude advantage because altitude can be translated into airspeed with a dive.
The enemy scrambled fighters, but the Americans hadn't spotted them yet. Vrashu's flight nosed over to start its strafing run on the enemy airstrip.
First 10 had already started their dive going down, and we were just preparing to, but I just took a look around back, look back over my shoulder, and that's when my mind was quickly changed.
There they were, 3,000 feet above, a swarm of Japanese Zeros closing fast from 7 o'clock. Vrashu radioed the other Hellcats, but they were already diving, so he decided to stay and provide cover.
I couldn't continue because then I'd have a stream of Zeros right behind us while we were going down.
Vrashu and Little are here. The other Hellcats are here diving, the Zeros attacking from above. If Vrashu dives, the Zeros will be on his and the squadron's 6 o'clock, a perfect attack position. His only option is to turn sharply into the enemy, minimizing his cross-section and reducing his time in the Zero's gun sights. Vrashu and Little pull a hard left turn and focus on the lead Zero.
He was already starting to shoot. I could see the twinkle of the guns. So I headed towards him and made a burst, a fast burst just to discourage him, and he stopped his run and just kept going down. They had a habit that they weren't afraid to attack, but once they were countered, they'd dive down for the water.
The first Zero darted away, but immediately another swung around onto Vrashu's tail. The American countered by pulling up into a steep chandelle. They were relying on the Hellcat's superior power, large wing area, and strong airframe to push them through the high G maneuver and turn the tables on the Zero.
The chandelle maneuver, it's basically a maneuver to try and point your aircraft in another direction in a fairly quick method. Instead of just doing a level turn, actually pitch your nose up high, roll over on a wing, and now you can use gravity, or what we like to call God's G, to help you out in the turn, allow you to pull your nose around faster and point in the other direction.
The Zero turned hard, trying to stay behind the Americans, but it couldn't handle the severe turn and stalled. The Hellcats then rolled over and got behind the falling Zero, primed for the kill. But more Zeros had arrived from high above.
I had ideas to try to follow him, but there were still some planes above me. I had to get them out of my back.
He doesn't want to be fighting anybody that can be sitting up on a perch 2,000 feet above him, who can then instantly dive down, pick up energy, and now have an advantage on him on a turn. So he wants to bring the whole fight down low if possible, to beat everybody down to the same state.
Vrashu and Little must neutralize the enemy's numerical and altitude advantage. They snap into a classic defensive maneuver, the thatch weave. In the thatch weave, the two Hellcats swing back and forth, providing mutual support and protection. If a Zero positions himself to fire on one of the Hellcats, he will fall under the guns of the second American fighter. Vrashu and Little were fighting for their very survival, as the Zeros came at them from every direction.
These Zeros were good. We were able to ward them off a little bit, but what they do, they'd fake you on one side, and then the guy would come from the other side and try to come on in.
Frustrated by their inability to score decisive hits, the Japanese descended to the Hellcat's altitude. It was a fatal mistake. The Americans immediately seized back the advantage and broke their defensive formation.
Up until that time, we were purely defensive. Once they came down to our level or below, then we were able then to go on the offense.
The Americans had skillfully turned the tables, and now it was the Zeros that were vulnerable to the powerful and highly maneuverable Hellcats. What ensued was the dogfight equivalent of a quick draw, with the winner determined by who could fire the first burst. Vrashu turned hard into the attacking Zero. As he did, the Japanese pilot dived to escape.
One of the favorite Japanese techniques, if engaged and in a defensive position, was to try to dive away and try to head for the water.
The technique worked with the Wildcat, but not with the Hellcat.
Once he caught on fire, okay, he'd gone down. You're looking for another one. You just go from one to the other and hope you get a dozen of them.
Vrashu then fixed his sights on a second Zero. The enemy tried to dive away, but the Hellcat easily caught him. It was Vrashu's second kill of the day. Next, he spotted a roof, the float plane version of a Zero. Again, the enemy dived away. Vrashu was merciless. His job, to relentlessly destroy the enemy.
And once I got on their tail, I didn't let go.
Kill number 3. Vrashu then spotted another Zero at 12 o'clock low.
I started to try to get in position, but he wouldn't let me. He kept ducking into a cloud.
The Zero was running from cloud to cloud, so Vrashu called on a basic dogfighting tactic.
I'm not going to let the SOB get away. So I just pulled up and kept looking for him while he was ducking in and out, and got in position to where I figured he couldn't see me. I pulled up into the sun and waited until I got a good shot, and I came down on him from 5 o'clock. I don't think he even knew what hit him.
Vrashu's 50 caliber armor-piercing rounds sliced into the Zero's wing tank and cockpit. And Vrashu's 4th kill of the day plummeted down in a flaming spiral. The American fighter sweep continued throughout the day, turning the skies above Truk into a swirling vortex of gunfire and flames.
There were loose fights all over the place. Those planes going down one every 30 seconds. This was a wild dogfight, a wild one.
The Americans were unrelenting. The ferocious combat cost the Japanese 130 planes in the air and another 74 on the ground. 8 Hellcats were lost, mostly from anti-aircraft fire.
Hellcats basically function like strike fighters, like F-18s of today. And the Hellcats went in as fighters and as fighter bombers to completely clean the sky of Japanese aircraft. So much so that there was no opposition to the bombers that went in later on.
On the planned second day of the attack, American bombers sunk 47 Japanese ships. Truk Atoll, the Gibraltar of the East, was left smoking and in ruins.
Results of the Truk raid were quite devastating to Japanese air power as well as the merchant fleet that had been at anchor inside the atoll. It was also an indication, once and for all, that Truk was no longer a bastion for the Japanese defense network, which was rapidly collapsing in the Central Pacific.
The skill of American pilots, combined with the Hellcat's superb flying characteristics, helped turn the tide against the Japanese.
The Hellcat in tremendous numbers, with great quality control, with survivability, with lethality, really made a difference in the Pacific War. 75% of all the Navy's air-to-air kills were from the Hellcat. It's a tremendous record.
What more can I say? We knew we had the best plane. It had a kill ratio that was 19-to-1. The greatest kill ratio of any plane in any war, in any country. And to me, it was up to us to demonstrate our use of it, to do it, and do it well.
The war would go on for another 18 months. By the end, the Hellcat had claimed nearly 5,300 Japanese aircraft. Japanese air power was dead, and the Hellcat was the executioner.
I'm John McAlbot, and ever since I can remember, I've sliced things open in search of the mysteries inside.